The first shot didn't hit the house. It hit the frozen pump, shattering the iron handle into a spray of black shards that hissed against the icy dirt. Reza Thorne didn't flinch. She stood by the heavy oak table in their cabin, tucked deep into the blue-shadowed crevices of the Bitterroot Mountains. Unlike the dusty, sun-bleached plains of the south, this land was a cathedral of frost and towering cedar. At 30, Reza's face was a map of high-altitude survival wind-burned cheekbones, a small scar across the bridge of her nose from a frozen branch, and eyes the color of a lake just before it freezes solid. She was a woman built of corded muscle and quiet resolve, dressed in trousers of heavy elk hide and a shearling coat stained with pine resin. "This is your last night in this home," she said, her voice low and steady, cutting through the panicked breathing of her husband. Silas was hunched over a crate in the corner, his fingers shaking as he fumbled with a set of delicate brass instruments. He wasn't a gunman, nor was he a rancher. He was a man of gears and escapements, a master horologist who had fled the smog-choked streets of San Francisco with a secret ticking in his pocket. He looked up, his spectacles reflecting the amber glow of the hearth. "We can hold them off, Rez. The walls are reinforced with railroad ties. They can't just burn us out in this humidity." "They aren't after the walls, Silas," Reza replied, sliding a long-barreled Sharps rifle from its leather sheath. She checked the action, the click of the metal sounding like a death knell in the small room. "They're after the silence you stole. And tonight, the ice is thin enough for them to fall through." Outside, the silver thaw had begun, a rare, treacherous mountain phenomenon where a sudden warm breeze from the coast collided with the sub-zero peaks. It coated the entire world in a glass-like sheen of melting ice, making every surface a mirror and every footstep a thunderclap. The trees groaned under the weight of the translucent armor, and the air smelled of wet stone and ozone. The men outside weren't typical outlaws. They didn't wear dusters or spurs. They were the Gentry, a private militia hired by the transcontinental rail barons, dressed in heavy wool peacoats and wielding experimental muffled carbines that fired with a soft, pneumatic thud rather than a roar. They moved like ghosts through the frozen timber. A second shot took out the stained glass window Reza had hauled over the mountain pass on a mule 3 years ago. The colored shards, cobalt, emerald, and ruby, fell like frozen jewels onto the floorboards, scattered amongst the sawdust and clock springs. "Get the girl," Reza commanded. Her tone brooked no argument. In the subfloor cellar, 7-year-old June was huddled not with a doll, but with a mechanical bird Silas had built for her. Its brass wings clicked in the dark, a rhythmic whir-tap that seemed to pulse in time with the girl's own frantic heartbeat. Reza felt a pang of sharp, jagged grief. They had built this life on the literal edge of the world to escape the mechanical rot of the industrial cities. Yet here it was, knocking on their door with lead and pressurized powder. Reza kicked open the back door. The air hit her like a wet shroud. The world was shimmering, a surreal landscape of glowing ice under a bloated, pale moon. The forest didn't look like wood and leaf. It looked like a graveyard of crystal. She saw a shadow move near the woodpile, a man shifting his weight, his spiked boots crunching through the frozen crust. She didn't fire her rifle yet. A muzzle flash would be a beacon in this mirrored world. Instead, she reached for a glass jar on the porch lintel, filled with a volatile mixture of kerosene and crushed magnesium she'd salvaged from a nearby mining camp. She hurled it against a cedar trunk near the shadow. The jar shattered, and the chemical reaction created a blinding, white flare that bounced off the icy trees, multiplying the light 1,000 times. The scout cried out, clutching his eyes. His silhouette burned into the silver air. "Go to the creek," Reza whispered to Silas as he emerged from the cellar with June tucked under one arm and a heavy satchel under the other. "The ice is thick enough to ride the sled, but thin enough to break if they follow with horses." I'll meet you at the Black Pillar." "Reza, you can't stay," Silas pleaded, his voice cracking. "The Mercer is with them. He doesn't want the plans anymore. He wants the prototype." "The prototype is my daughter," Reza hissed, shoving a pack of salted meat and ammunition into his arms. "Now move, Silas, or the last thing you'll ever hear is the sound of your own heart stopping." She watched them disappear into the glowing, misty woods, Silas sliding awkwardly on the ice while June clung to his neck. Reza turned back to the house. She didn't feel like a victim. She felt like the mountain itself, cold, ancient, and unforgiving. She knew every fracture in the stone, every hollow in the ice. She stepped off the porch, her own boots fitted with custom iron creepers she had forged herself. She moved with a silent, predatory grace that the men from the city could never hope to mimic. To her left, the forest groaned. A massive branch, overburdened by the silver thaw, snapped with the force of a cannon shot. It crashed down, bringing a cascade of ice shards with it. Through the shimmering haze, Reza saw them, 4 men fanning out in a semicircle. They didn't carry lanterns. They wore strange, brass-rimmed goggles designed to pierce the mountain mist. "Mrs. Thorne!" A voice called out, a voice as smooth and cold as a river stone. It was the Mercer. He was standing near the shattered pump, his charcoal gray coat draped over his narrow shoulders like a shroud. He held a silver-topped cane, using it to test the ice in front of him. "There is no need for further damage to the property. We only require the regulator. Hand over the child, and Silas can keep his ledgers and his life." Reza crouched behind a frost-covered boulder, her breath rising in a thin plume of silver. She didn't answer. Words were a waste of oxygen. She checked the window light, erratic breeze that smelled of coming snow. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of magnetite. She wasn't just a frontierswoman. She was a daughter of these peaks, and she knew that beneath the ice, the mountain was a living thing of magnetic currents and hidden ore. She placed the stone on the flat surface of the boulder and watched it quiver, pointing toward the heavy metal equipment the Gentry carried. They were using magnetized, tracking needles to find June. Silas hadn't just built a clock. He'd built a masterpiece of biomechanical engineering to replace June's failing heart. And the internal magnets were singing a song that Gentry could hear from a mile away. "You're hunting a child with a compass," Reza muttered to herself. A grim smile touching her lips, she stood up, exposing herself for a fraction of a second. Thud, thud, thud. 3 muffled rounds chewed into the boulder, sending chips of granite and ice flying. She sprinted toward the old ice mine, a deep fissure in the earth where the mountain's natural refrigeration kept the winter's haul frozen all year round. If she could lead them there, she could use the silver thaw against them. The heat from the sudden warm wind was turning the mine's entrance into a death trap of slick slopes and false floors. "She's running!" One of the scouts yelled. Reza didn't run like a frightened animal. She ran like a lure. She leapt over a fallen log, her creepers biting deep into the bark, and vanished into the mouth of the fissure. The interior was a cathedral of blue light, the walls dripping with meltwater that refroze into long, jagged spears. She heard the Gentry entering behind her, their heavy, rhythmic breathing echoing off the wet stone. They were confident. They had the numbers, the technology, and the contract, but they didn't have the mountain. Reza reached the center of the cavern, where a massive pillar of ice connected the ceiling to the floor. She didn't use her gun. She took out a small blasting cap, one she'd stolen from the railroad surveyors months ago. She didn't set it to blow the rock. She jammed it into a stress crack in the ice pillar. "Come and get the silence," she whispered as the first scout rounded the corner. His goggles glowing in the dark, Reza struck the cap with the butt of her rifle. The explosion was small, but in the echo chamber of the ice mine, it sounded like the world was ending. The pillar shivered. A hairline fracture raced upward, spiderwebbing through the translucent ceiling. Then the silver thaw did the rest. The weight of the melting ice on the surface, suddenly deprived of its support, came crashing down. Tons of frozen earth and timber collapsed into the entrance, sealing the scouts inside a tomb of crystal. Reza didn't stay to watch. She knew a side vent, a narrow squeeze through the basalt that led to the upper ridges. As she crawled through the freezing dark, the smell of wet earth filling her lungs, she knew this was only the beginning. The Mercer was still outside, and he wouldn't stop until he heard the ticking stop. She emerged onto the ridge, gasping for air. Below her, the valley was a sea of silver mist. She looked toward the black pillar where her family was waiting. The hunt was no longer about a clock or a heart. It was a war for the soul of the frontier. Reza didn't wait to hear the screams of the men trapped beneath the ice shelf. In the Bitterroots, mercy was a luxury that froze to death by mid-October, and she had a family to reach. She crested the ridge, her lungs burning with the intake of crystalline air that felt like swallowing needles. The silver thaw was reaching its peak. The sudden warmth had turned the mountain into a treacherous sliding mirror, but the temperature was already beginning to teeter back toward a brutal snap. Every branch was encased in an inch of clear ice, making the forest look like a cathedral built of glass and bone. She moved with a rhythmic, mechanical precision, her iron creepers biting into the slick granite as she navigated toward the black pillar. She found Silas and June huddled in the lee of a basalt overhang. Silas was frantically checking the seals on his heavy satchel, his hands trembling so violently that he dropped his brass calibrator into the slush. June sat perfectly still, her eyes wide and fixed on the shimmering woods. The mechanical bird in her lap was quiet, but the faint, rhythmic thud-click emanating from the girl's own chest was audible in the heavy silence of the mountain. It was a sound that haunted Reza, the proof that her daughter's life was no longer entirely her own, but a series of precise metallic pulses designed by a man who had been too afraid to let go. "They're coming for the sound." "Silas," Reza said, her voice a sharp rasp as she reached them. She didn't offer a hug or a soft word. The mountain didn't allow for them yet. She grabbed Silas by the shoulder and forced him to look at her. "The scouts in the mine are gone, but the Mercer is still out there. He's got something loud, Silas. I heard it humming through the rock." Silas wiped his spectacles on his damp sleeve, his face pale and drawn. "It's a resonance crawler, Rez. They were developing it for the mines in Nevada. It's built to find specific vibrations in the earth. If June's regulator is running at full capacity, that machine will find her like a wolf finding a wounded calf." "Then we change the song," Reza said, looking down at the girl. She knelt in the melting slush, putting her hands on June's shoulders. The girl felt unnaturally warm, a byproduct of the friction from the Clockwork heart beating beneath her ribs. "June, honey, I need you to hold the bird tight. I need you to be as still as a stone. Can you do that for me?" June nodded, her voice a small silver thread. "The mountain is crying, Mama. I can hear the ice breaking." "That's just the thaw," Reza lied. "It's the mountain making way for us." They began the descent. Toward the Whispering Gallery, a natural limestone canyon where the walls were curved in such a way that a whisper at one end could be heard a mile away at the other. It was a dangerous path, slick, narrow, and prone to rock slides, but it was the only way to reach the deep thermal vents that could mask June's signature. As they entered the mouth of the canyon, the acoustic properties of the stone took over. The sound of their breathing amplified, echoing back at them like the panting of a giant. Suddenly, a new sound joined the chorus. It was a low, guttural thrumming that vibrated through the very solace of their boots. It wasn't the wind or the shifting ice. It was a rhythmic, mechanical stomp, heavy, deliberate, and terrifyingly fast. "The crawler," Silas whispered. and the word hissed through the canyon like a snake. High above the canyon rim, a searchlight cut through the mist. It wasn't the yellow glow of a kerosene lamp. It was a harsh, electric blue that turned the ice into a blinding, fractured landscape. The Mercer's voice followed, amplified by a brass megaphone on the machine's hull. The sound bounced off the limestone walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Silas Thorne. You cannot hide the girl in the dark. Her heart is a beacon. You were the one who tuned it to the frequency of the company's pride. Give us the asset, and you may keep the woman. Reza felt a surge of cold fury. To the Mercer, June wasn't a child. She was an asset, a prototype for a more efficient workforce, a bridge between the frailty of human flesh and the tireless endurance of the machine. She looked at Silas, and for the first time, she saw the true weight of his guilt. He hadn't just saved June. He had used the company's most guarded secrets to do it, and in doing so, he had turned their daughter into a piece of proprietary technology. Keep moving, Reza commanded, shoving them deeper into the gallery. The floor of the canyon was a mess of rotten ice, slush that looked solid but would give way into freezing pools of meltwater. They moved in a zigzag pattern, trying to stay in the shadows of the overhangs. The crawler moved above them, its steam-driven legs punching into the ridge with a sound like hammers on an anvil. It was a monstrous thing of brass and iron, a multi-legged spider that hissed white plumes of steam into the night air. There! Silas pointed toward a series of old telegraph poles that had been abandoned decades ago when the silver veins ran dry. The wires were heavy with ice, sagging like black vines across the canyon floor. If I can get to the junction box at the base of that pylon, I might be able to create a ground loop. It would throw off the crawler's sensors. Do it, Reza said. She handed him a heavy iron wrench from her belt. I'll draw the light. She didn't wait for his protest. Reza scrambled up a pile of frost-covered scree, her movements frantic and loud. She fired a shot from her Sharps rifle, not at the crawler, which was armored in reinforced steel, but at a massive, overhanging sheet of ice perched precariously on the opposite rim. The bullet struck the hinge of the ice sheet. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that sounded like the mountain itself was screaming, the ice shattered. Hundreds of tons of frozen shards cascaded down the canyon wall, creating a deafening roar in the cloud of white powder that choked the air. The crawler's searchlight swung wildly toward the noise, the blue beam cutting through the dust like a blade. Reza used the distraction to slide down the embankment, her coat protecting her from the jagged rocks down at the pylon. Silas was working with a frantic, desperate speed. He had opened the rusted junction box and was stripping the insulation from the telegraph wires with his teeth. June stood beside him, clutching her bird, her eyes fixed on the massive machine silhouetted against the moon on the ridge above. Almost. Silas muttered. He jammed a copper lead into the wet earth and connected it to the main line. A shower of orange sparks erupted from the box. The telegraph wires began to hum, a high-pitched whine that vibrated through the canyon. The crawler stopped in its tracks. Its sensors, tuned to find the delicate rhythm of June's heart, were suddenly overwhelmed by a massive surging surge of electromagnetic noise. The machine bucked, its front legs kicking out into the empty air as the pilot struggled to recalibrate. Now run! Reza shouted, grabbing June by the waist and hoisting her over a fallen cedar. They ran toward the iron orchard, a graveyard of rusted mining equipment that lay at the far end of the gallery. But the Mercer was no fool. He knew the limitations of his machine. From the back of the crawler, a hatch opened, and 3 men in heavy wool coats descended on ropes, their boots hitting the ice with the precision of trained soldiers. They weren't blinded by the noise. They were hunters, and they had caught the scent dot as Reza reached the edge of the orchard. She looked back. The silver thaw was ending. The warm breeze had died, and the air was plummeting back into a deep, killing freeze. The slush beneath their feet was turning into solid, jagged glass. If they didn't reach the thermal vent soon, they would be trapped in the open, frozen in place for the Mercer to harvest. She saw the Mercer himself step onto the ridge, his silver-topped cane gleaming in the blue light. He didn't look like a man on a hunt. He looked like a collector reaching for a rare butterfly. "You're tired, Reza." The Mercer's voice drifted down, no longer amplified, but carried by the eerie acoustics of the canyon. "The mountain is cold, and your daughter is a delicate thing. How long do you think those gears will turn in the deep freeze? Bring her to me, and I will put her in a warm room. I will give her the oil and the maintenance she needs to survive." Reza didn't answer. She pulled June closer, feeling the frantic metallic thudding in the girl's chest. The prototype was shivering, her lips turning a faint shade of blue. "We go to the vents," Reza whispered, her voice like grinding stone. "And if he follows us there, we'll see if his machine can breathe steam when the mountain starts to boil." They plunged into the iron orchard, a forest of rusted cranes and jagged gears. As the first flakes of a new, heavy snow began to fall, turning the silver world into a blur of white and iron, the snap hit the iron orchard with the force of a physical blow. Within minutes, the slush that had lubricated their frantic escape crystallized into jagged, immovable teeth. The world was no longer fluid. It was a brittle, clicking landscape of frozen rust. Reza led them deeper into the maze of skeletal mining structures, her hand gripped tight around June's small, shivering palm. The girl's breathing had become shallow, each exhale a puff of silver vapor that seemed to linger too long in the frigid air. Beneath the elk-hide coat, June's chest was emitting a frantic, high-pitched whirring, the sound of clockwork struggling against the seizing cold. They reached the center of the orchard, a hollowed-out clearing where the remains of a massive ore crusher stood like a rusted gallows. The iron was coated in a thick rime of frost, making the entire structure look like it had been carved from salt. Reza shoved Silas and June into the narrow gap between two immense, frozen gears, the teeth of which were taller than a man. "Keep her warm." "Silas, use your own body heat," Reza commanded, her eyes scanning the perimeter. She began unbuckling a heavy leather roll from her pack. Inside were 4 sticks of old dynamite, the wrappers sweating beads of nitroglycerin that had turned into unstable crystals in the cold. Silas pulled June against his chest, tucking her head under his chin. He could feel the vibration of the regulator in her chest. It was skipping beats, a mechanical hitch that sent a jolt of terror through his spine. "Reza, the lubricants in her casing are thickening. If her core temperature drops another 5 degrees, the friction will fuse the brass plates." She sees. "Then we end this now," Reza said, her voice devoid of any tremor. She looked at the towering shadow of the ridge above them. The crawler had reappeared, its blue searchlight cutting a wide, clinical swath through the iron orchard. It moved slower now, the extreme cold taxing its hydraulic joints, but it was relentless. The Mercer was no longer calling out. He didn't need to. He could see the heat signatures of the thermal vents just a few hundred yards beyond the orchard, and he knew they were cornered. Suddenly, a metallic clatter erupted to their left. One of the Mercer scouts had found them, his brass-rimmed goggles reflecting the moonlight like the eyes of a giant insect. He raised a muffled carbine, but Reza was faster. She didn't fire her rifle. The recoil on the slick ground was too risky. Instead, she swung a heavy iron chain she'd salvaged from the ore crusher. The cold had made the metal brittle, and when it struck the scout's shoulder, the chain shattered into a dozen lethal fragments. The man went down with a muffled cry, his blood steaming as it hit the ice. "They're flanking us," Silas hissed. "Stay down," Reza yelled. She grabbed one of the dynamite sticks and tied it to a heavy iron bolt. She didn't have a fuse long enough to reach the crawler, so she did the unthinkable. She began to climb. She scaled the frozen ore crusher, her fingers numbing until they felt like wooden blocks. Every time she moved, the frost on the iron groaned, a sound that amplified in the silent orchard. She reached the top of the gallows frame, 50 feet above the ground. From here, she could see the Mercer's crawler clearly. It was a beautiful, horrific thing, a testament to the progress Silas had once worshipped. The Mercer was standing on the open observation deck, his silver cane hooked over the railing, looking like a conductor overseeing a symphony of destruction. Reza Thorne. The Mercer's voice was thin and sharp in the cold. "You are fighting the inevitable. The girl belongs to the future. You are merely a relic of the mud and the snow." Reza didn't reply. She watched as 2 more scouts moved toward the gears where Silas and June were hiding. She looked down at the dynamite in her hand. She needed a spark. She looked at the heavy, ice-laden telegraph wire that Silas had grounded earlier. It was still humming with the feedback loop, vibrating with a lethal charge of static electricity. Over the edge of the crusher, her boots slipping on the rime. She swung the iron bolt with the dynamite attached. Aiming for the crawler's venting port, the one place where the internal heat of the steam engine met the freezing air. As she threw it, a scout on the ground fired. The bullet didn't hit Reza. It struck the iron frame she was standing on. The shock wave caused her to lose her footing. She tumbled backward, her arm hooking around a rusted support beam at the last second. The dynamite sailed through the air, trailing a thin plume of frost. It didn't reach the vent. It snagged on the electrified telegraph wire just 10 feet from the crawler's hull. For a second, the world held its breath. Then the static charge from the wire jumped to the sweating nitroglycerin. The explosion wasn't a roar. In the thin, frozen air, it was a sharp, ear-splitting crack that shattered every window in the abandoned mining office 100 yards away. The telegraph wire snapped, lashing out like a whip of blue fire. It struck the crawler's main sensor array, sending a surge of electricity through the brass hull. The machine screamed. Its internal gears, already stressed by the snap, began to grind against one another. Steam erupted from the seams in a blinding white cloud. Reza dropped from the gallows frame, landing in a snowbank that saved her legs from breaking. She scrambled to her feet, her Sharp's rifle in hand. Through the steam and the smoke, she saw the Mercer. He was still on the deck, his face twisted in a mask of cold rage. He pulled a long-barreled pistol, a sleek, nickel-plated thing, and aimed it directly at the spot where Silas and June were hidden. "If I cannot have the prototype intact, I will have the components." The Mercer shrieked, "No." Silas's voice erupted from the gears. He stepped out into the open, his arms raised. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding the mechanical bird. "Mercer, look at the bird. Look at the frequency." The Mercer paused, his finger tightening on the trigger. Silas began to wind the bird, but he was doing it wrong. He was overwinding it, forcing the spring past its breaking point. The sound it made was a discordant, jarring screech that seemed to vibrate in the teeth of everyone present. June followed him out, her face pale but her eyes fixed on her father. She reached out and touched the iron pylon of the telegraph line. "Now, June," Silas cried. The girl didn't speak. She simply closed her eyes. The regulator in her chest, influenced by the massive electromagnetic field Silas had created with the ground loop and the overwound bird, began to sink. It wasn't a heartbeat anymore. It was a broadcast. The remaining scouts dropped their weapons, clutching their heads as the frequency of the girl's heart, amplified by the iron orchard's rusted geometry, turned the air into a wall of sonic pressure. The Mercer staggered, his silver cane falling from his hand and shattering on the ice like glass. The crawler groaned one last time, its massive boiler losing pressure as the feedback loop fried its internal regulators. It sagged to the left, its legs buckling until it looked like a dying beast of the old world. Reza reached Silas and June, her rifle leveled at the remaining men who were crawling away in agony. She looked at Silas, her eyes demanding the truth. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I gave her the mountain," Silas gasped, his face ashen. "I didn't just build a heart, Rez. I built a resonator. She's not just part machine. She's part of the Earth's own pulse now. The Mercer can't take her because he can't contain the mountain." But the victory was fragile. The Mercer was still standing, leaning against the smoking wreck of his machine. He pulled a small, black device from his pocket, a signal flare. He looked at Reza with a chilling smile. "The second crawler is already at the base of the pass," he wheezed. "You've destroyed a toy. You haven't stopped the company." He triggered the flare. A streak of crimson fire shot into the black sky, bursting into a bloody star that illuminated the entire valley. In the distance, the low, rhythmic thrumming of a much larger engine began to echo through the peaks. Reza looked at June, whose chest was now glowing with a soft, amber light through the fabric of her coat. The girl looked at the mountain, then back at her mother. "We have to go to the pillar, Mama," June said, her voice sounding strangely resonant, as if she were speaking through a silver flute. "The mountain wants to speak back." Reza grabbed her rifle and slung it over her shoulder. She looked at the crimson light fading in the sky. They were out of time, out of tricks, and nearly out of breath. But as she looked at the black pillar towering in the distance, she felt a surge of something more powerful than fear. "Move," Reza said, her voice a promise of war. "We're going to the top." The ascent to the summit of the black pillar was a climb through a vertical graveyard of frost. The air had thinned until every breath felt like a draft of liquid nitrogen, searing the lungs and blurring the vision. Reza led the way, her fingers raw and bleeding where the ice had peeled away her skin, but she did not stop. Behind her, Silas carried June. The girl's weight seemingly lighter as the amber glow in her chest pulsed with a rhythmic solar intensity. The second crawler, a massive dreadnought of black iron 3 times the size of the first, was already tearing through the iron orchard below. Its searchlights sweeping the mountainside like the fingers of a searching Titan dot, they reached the plateau of the pillar, just as the moon reached its zenith. The summit was a flat expanse of obsidian rock, scoured clean of snow by the ferocious high-altitude winds. In the center stood an ancient geological anomaly, a Thaw, natural circle of magnetite spires that looked like the teeth of the mountain itself. As June stepped onto the obsidian, the amber light in her chest flared and the spires began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the marrow in Reza's bones. "The resonance," Silas gasped, setting June down. He was shivering violently, his strength spent. "The pillar isn't just rock, Reza. It's a natural amplifier. The company didn't just want June for her heart. They wanted her as a key to unlock the mineral wealth of the entire range. She can shatter the stone with a pulse." A metallic clatter announced the arrival of the enemy. A lift cable had been fired from the crawler below, and a steam-powered winch had hauled a small platform to the summit. The Mercer stepped off, his charcoal coat tattered and his face a mask of frost-bitten rage. He was alone now, his scouts left behind in the frozen carnage of the orchard, but he held a heavy, high-pressure steam pistol that hissed with a lethal intent. "The end of the line." "Mrs. Thorne," the Mercer said, his voice whistling through the gaps in his teeth. He looked at June, and his eyes filled with a terrifying, religious fervor. "Look at her. She is beautiful. She is the perfect fusion of the industrial spirit and the wild earth. You are holding back the tide of history for a sentiment. Move aside." Reza stood her ground, her Sharp's rifle leveled at the Mercer's chest. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but her aim was as steady as the mountain. History is written by the survivors, Mercer, and you aren't leaving this rock. Neither are you, the Mercer countered. He didn't aim at Reza. He aimed at the obsidian beneath June's feet. The pressure in this pistol is enough to crack that stone. If I fire, the vibration will feedback through her regulator. She shatter from the inside out. Give her to me, and I will stabilize the frequency. Silas moved to intervene, but Reza caught his eye. She saw the truth in the way the magnetite spires were reacting to June. The girl wasn't a victim of the vibration. She was the conductor. June wasn't shivering anymore. She stood in the center of the circle, her hands open, her small face turned toward the sky. The mechanical bird lay at her feet, its brass wings vibrating so fast they became a golden blur. "Mama," June said, and her voice didn't carry over the wind, it moved through the ground. "He's part of the noise. I can hear the steam in his heart. It's out of tune." Reza realized then that the Mercer's obsession had led him to enhance himself as well. Beneath his heavy coat, a series of brass tubes and a small, hissing boiler were integrated into his spine to give him the strength to endure the mountain. He was the very thing he sought to capture. "June, now!" Reza screamed. Reza didn't fire her rifle. She dropped it and lunged for Silas, pulling him flat against the obsidian. At that same moment, June let out a sound, not a scream, but a single pure note that harmonized with the humming magnetite. The amber light in her chest exploded into a blinding pillar of radiance that shot straight into the black sky. The effect was instantaneous. The magnetic field of the black pillar inverted. The Mercer's steam pistol disintegrated in his hand. The metal parts repelled with such force they vanished into the darkness. The Mercer himself was lifted off his feet as the iron in his own body reacted to the surge. He screamed, a sound of grinding metal and human terror, as the feedback from June's heart met the unstable boiler on his back. With a final, thunderous crack, the geothermal vent beneath the pillar, the one Reza had noted during the thaw, erupted. The pressure of the steam, manipulated by the sonic pulse, blew the center of the plateau upward. The Mercer was swept away by a geyser of scalding white vapor and shattering stone, cast out into the abyss of the canyon below. He didn't fall like a man. He fell like a broken machine, sparks trailing from his spine until the darkness swallowed him whole. The second crawler, caught in the landslide triggered by the eruption, was buried under 1,000 tons of falling granite. The lights went out. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was so deep it felt like the world had been muted. Reza pushed herself up, her ears ringing. The amber light in June's chest had faded to a soft, natural glow, the color of a guttering candle. The girl was slumped in the center of the circle, exhausted but breathing. Silas crawled to her, his hands trembling as he checked the regulator. It's balanced," Silas whispered, a sob of relief breaking his voice. "The surge. It burnt out the tracking frequency. She's just a girl again, Rez. A girl with a very quiet, very steady heart." Reza looked out over the edge of the pillar. The valley below was a jagged scar of ice and rock. The Gentry were gone, their machines buried, their contracts rendered moot by the sheer, chaotic power of the wilderness. The silver thaw had ended, and a true calm winter was settling in. The stars above were cold and indifferent, but for the first time in years, they didn't feel like watchers. They didn't stay on the summit. Reza helped Silas carry June down the backside of the mountain, away from the ruins of their home and the graveyard of the iron orchard. They moved toward the green basin, the hidden thermal valley Reza had found during her long winters of hunting. It was a place where the steam didn't drive engines, but warmed the earth enough for grass to grow in the snow. As the sun began to rise, painting the Bitterroot peaks in shades of violet and rose, they reached the tree line. Reza stopped and looked back. The black pillar stood tall and silent, a tombstone for the Mercer and a monument to their survival. She reached into her pocket and found a single piece of the stained glass window she had tucked away, a fragment of deep, cobalt blue. "This is your last night in the cold," Reza said softly. Looking at June and Silas, they built a new life there in the hidden heart of the mountains. Silas never built another clock. He spent his days carving wood and learning the language of the wind in the cedars. June grew tall and strong, her heart a secret shared only with the peaks and the silent stones. And Reza Thorne remained the guardian of the pass, a woman who had faced the future with a rifle and a piece of ice, and one. The world outside continued its march toward the machine. But in the Bitterroots, the only rhythm that mattered was the slow, steady beat of a life lived free. The mystery of the Thorne family became a legend among the mountain men, a story of a girl whose heart could move mountains and a mother who was the mountain itself. The home they had lost was just wood and glass. The home they found was eternal.